Good morning. This is Kenneth with the Advancing Equity Coalition here with a special guest today, Kelly Drummer of McGizzy Communications. How are you doing today, Kelly?
I'm great. It's a beautiful day here in Minneapolis.
Yeah. So we are super excited to have this conversation with Kelly about National American Indian Heritage Month. And to have a real conversation about specifically our American Indian students in Minneapolis public schools and what is the reality of our American Indian students currently. And so before we get all the way into that, Kelly, do you want to introduce yourself and the work that McGizzy does?
Sure. I'm Kelly Drummer. I'm Oglala Lakota, and I've been with McGizzy for 3 years. And prior to that, I was involved with my work with TY Foundation in working with youth on a Gathering of Sacred Voices initiative we had that we supported a staff member that was leading youth in gaining their voice. But I've been here for 3 years and really have seen a great change, been through quite a bit. We developed a brand new building, and the pandemic hit, and then during the uprising we lost our building. So the organization for the past 3 years has been in a bit of a crisis, from moving to a new location, being in that new location, the pandemic and the fire. And so but we've been working in Minneapolis public schools for close to 40 years. And so we started our work in media and started the First Person Radio. And First Person Radio was a national American Indian radio program that was in and on the air from 1977 to the mid-90s. And so that really was like the core of our work. We got college students and high school students engaged in radio and media production. And then in the early 80s, when the disparities really in education were really being highlighted for American Indian students, that's when we really started engaging with Minneapolis public schools, mostly in technology supports. We were like the first Indian organization to have like a high-tech computers and things like that in the 90s, and having access for students to come and do their work on computers, and then also our work in radio, and then moving into film in the 90s and 2000s.
Very cool. So what does the partnership with Minneapolis Public Schools look like now?
So it is still a very robust partnership, particularly in the past 10 years. We've actually been in South High's All Nations classrooms with physical staff. So, and we still have that continued today. We've had many federal grants that have supported our work in the outcomes in education in Minneapolis public schools. And since I've been here for the past 3 years, we now work in St. Paul Public Schools at Harding. And we are in the classroom at Harding as well. And then we run cultural groups with Fridley, Farmington, Hopkins, and most recently Wayzata schools, and supporting their cultural supports with their Indian education programs. So, but our heart and soul has really been with Minneapolis. We've been in Minneapolis for almost 45 years and worked with the students in Minneapolis. So very dedicated. We continue to raise money, for based on our strategic plan to continue the support in the classroom and then after school.
Cool. Very awesome. So yeah, again, you are a coalition member. McGizzy is a member of the Advancing Equity Coalition. And so we've just learned so much from you. And it's been so important to have your voice and the voice of American Indian students, families, community, really informing like some of the policy actions, policy recommendations, identifying the problems that have been coming up. And so before we get all the way into that, I did want to obviously acknowledge again that this is National American Indian Heritage Month, and talk a little bit about like what type of programming have you seen being taken place right now in Minneapolis public schools?
Yes, so last week, Minneapolis Public Schools held American Indian Family Involvement Week, and they had specific days like Rock Your Mocks, wearing orange for remembrance of the children and survivors of boarding school, wearing red for missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so it was across the district, and many schools participated. So, some of our schools, like South High, for example, has over 200 American Indian students, where if you're going to like Southwest or something like that, there may be like 20 high school students. And then some of the elementaries may have 4 or 5 or 1 American Indian student. So really getting those schools involved and to raise the visibility of American Indian children in our school district. And so there were celebrations that happened at the opening and the closing. McGizzy, actually, we received a National Urban Indian Family Coalition grant, and we did a digital equity survey over the past couple months and found really disparities in equity and computer access. And so we purchased 90 computers, and we've been distributing them all last week and part of this week to students that are in need of computers. So that was kind of our contribution to American Family and Following Week. We met parents and students, and it's been a really exciting week for us as far as our work, and then the ability to give really nice computers to our students.
That's awesome. It is, I think, really important that we acknowledge and recognize that, there's this like large population of American Indian students across the district. There's a Department of Indian Education in the district, but there are also still these issues of visibility. And I'm curious, again, from your perspective or your vantage point, like how the issues of visibility, because there are only maybe one student in an entire building, how does that impact, the conversation around the disparities that we see, especially amongst American Indian students, and the challenges and the barriers? How does that impact the discussions around how we can address some of the challenges that the American Indian students are experiencing in Minneapolis Public Schools?
So one of the the things that we've been working with Indian education on is really having a dedicated person at each school that is actually a counselor that's dedicated, so that the students that maybe are in a student population where there's maybe 5 or so students, like for example, in elementary school, there may be 5 elementary students, but working with Indian Ed and actually providing those supports at the school in a more deliberate and intentional way. And then our pathway sites, which I'll talk about a little bit later, there's a larger population, so there's a more dedicated support system, but really looking at not only where our pathway schools are, but across the entire district. So that's a change really in our work with Indian Ed and with the school district, is to look at it holistically versus where the highest population is. Because then that also, those supports help that student raise the visibility of that student's particular needs, culture, all those things. And so that's one of the things that's a big change and shift, I think, within the district and with Indian Ed, is a more deliberate focus across the district versus just 1 or 2 schools.
Sure. Yeah, I think that makes sense. And so, I know you already introduced this idea of pathway schools. And so let's get into it. The last school board meeting, the district presented to the board a first reading of the Memorandum of Agreement between Minneapolis Public Schools and the American Indian community around like how services were going to be provided and what opportunities were available for American Indian students. And so I know this is something that you've been pretty involved in. And so, I'd love for you to explain to our audience, like, what is this Memorandum of Agreement, and, what does it lay out for American Indian students?
Yes, so this is actually the 3rd version of the Memorandum of Agreement. Elaine Salinas, my predecessor here at McGizzy, she was here from 2003 to 2018. She was a really instrumental leader in creating the Memorandum of Agreement, along with the Phillips Indian Educators Group, which is a subgroup of MUD, the Minneapolis Urban Indian Directors. So the Minneapolis Urban Indian Directors is made up of the 23 or 26, I can't remember the exact number, Indian organizations across the metro. And it's the executive directors that make up that group. And then there are subcommittees within that group, which Phillips Indian Educators is a subcommittee. And the PI group really has led the MOA throughout this entire process. So Elaine Salinas and the PI group were founders of the MOA and helped move that agreement with the district. And so this version now is obviously very different than the first version because at that time of the first version, we had Anishinaabe Academy, which was a K-8 school. And so Anishinaabe Academy was one of the pathway schools, along with Sanford, or not Sanford, that came later, and South High, All Nations program. So those were the two pathways. And since then, Anishinaabe Academy is now a K-5. And so a couple of years ago, I was involved with that process. They changed the pathway schools to Sanford and Northeast Middle School from Anishinaabe Academy, and then South High was the high school pathway. And so now really looking at this MOA that is going for board vote next month is really looking at, like I was talking about, a more holistic look at the district and all Indian students across the district instead of just the pathway schools, but still prioritizing the pathway schools. So Anishinaabe Academy is still the K-5 pathway school, Sanford and Northeast, and then South High, and now we've included Edison. Because what we're finding through this change from Anishinaabe being a K-8 and students going to Northeast as a pathway, that there's a big gap in students that are attending Northeast and then going to Edison. Some of them choose to go to Edison and some of them choose to go to South High. So in a pathway school, you're guaranteed transportation through that school. But obviously in high school, it's public transportation. So students from Northeast or North Minneapolis are traveling all the way to South High. And so how are we looking at it in a more holistic way where we're actually building the community that there's a very strong American Indian community in Northeast Minneapolis, and how do we build that and continue to build that? So we're not losing students that are going to districts like Columbia Heights and Farmington that now have or not Farmington, Fridley, that now have a pretty robust Indian Ed program. So that's really what the changes are in the MOA. And then the other change is really around data and measurement. So obviously with the pandemic, there's data that has come out. And really looking, usually we measure year by year, but since that learning loss of really 18 months of not being in the classroom, using that not as a fact, right? It's a fact, we know it's a fact, but then really looking at the first couple quarters of this year as the baseline, instead of establishing the baseline of, during a pandemic when kids weren't in school. But of course, there still is a lot of concerns because what we're seeing in some of the data is that this baseline is still not great. We'll be looking at first quarter data on December 3rd for American Indians across the district based on the MOA. So really looking at data and that implementation process in a more strategic way than having the MOA, just having community members like myself and Indian Education leading those conversations, but really more intentional focus with the district.
So going back to kind of the structure of the MOA really quickly. So you talked a little bit about the different pathways and I know you've said to me in the past, they're called best practice sites, these schools. So you talked about like transportation is guaranteed and there's like an intentionality to try to ensure that like there are a larger number of students in these sites. What else happens at a best practice site that makes it a best practice site, I guess?
Yep. So part of that is offering of Indigenous language, Ojibwe, and now they're offering Dakota language. There are specific activities that happen within the schools that do not happen in other schools. And so those, and then there's really teacher training and teachers that are trained in our professional development curriculum days, which are usually in August. And so those sites are best practice sites because the teachers are going through that professional development. There's language offered. There's also additional cultural activities and groups that happen at those best practice sites. And obviously like I said before, the language piece is also part of it.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds really awesome and really robust, and sounds like a really awesome opportunity. I think that's great that that this MOA exists. And, for those listening, I hope that you take the opportunity to share with your board members that they should pass and support this new MOA, because it is a really important thing. And one thing that I found really interesting back in our comprehensive district design advocacy is there are a lot of concerns around how would the comprehensive district design disrupt the MOA. And one of the things that we learned in that process is that the MOA supersedes any other decision that the district or the board makes. And so even though like Anishinaabe got reconfigured and they had to include Sanford, like they couldn't just like completely disrupt. They had to have a strong plan for there to be opportunities for American Indian students to continue to be in classes together, to receive the additional programming and the transportation support in order to get there. So I thought that was really cool and something I thought was really interesting. And I know you've said in the past that, this MOA, what would it look like to replicate this MOA for other student groups? We obviously have an Office of Black Student Achievement. What would that MOA look like? What would the MOA look like for a Latina student or a Latina students? What would it look like for our Somali students, our English language learning students, our Asian students? So yeah, I think that's a really cool thing to start conceptualizing and thinking about, like what could that look like? What would that look like? And it's not like we're asking for segregated sites, but also how can we make sure that there is programming available that is really intentional about like keeping people's background, history, culture alive and moving. And also the intentional professional development is so important, especially as we talk about culturally relevant instruction. So before I let you go, you did also hint at another thing just in terms of like the pandemic and how the pandemic has disrupted and impacted American Indian students. And so I wanted to, just kind of give you the floor to share, what are some of the things that you've heard, seen from how the pandemic has impacted American Indian students?
Yes, so part of the MOA is, like I said, is this baseline data. So we do know where students were at the end of, the end of last school year, but really looking at the first 2 quarters and seeing where kids are at in the first 2 quarters to set that baseline data, because that'll be 5 years of kind of where we're at, and then where we want to be. And so we haven't set that yet in the MOA. That will be to come. But part of that intentionality is then monitoring that and really pushing what needs to happen if the data isn't, looking very good. But at the end of the year last year, it's concerning because our 9th grade students, there were only 30% that were credit on track after ending 9th grade to graduate in 5 years. And we were at closer to 50% prior to the pandemic. So, we've lost.
Sorry, pause. Say those numbers one more time, just so that we don't lose them.
30% of 9th graders at the end of last year were on track.
Wow.
To graduate on time.
Okay.
So that means 70% of American Indian students leaving 9th grade last year were not credit on track to graduate in 5 years.
Wow.
So that is a lot. And we were at about 50%, which is the lowest of any population. It was not great, but we really, have a setback. And then the other data is K-8. At the end of last year, 11% were proficient in reading and math. So the data is now kind of coming out around that. And so we will know the first quarter review and see where we're at with that. But then looking at first and second quarter and setting that data and that measurement of where we want progress to fall and move towards. So, and also attendance, even in the pandemic, prior to the pandemic it's a huge struggle in our community. And that did not improve during the pandemic and going into the first quarter. What we're hearing from teachers and other counselors is that it's a huge struggle going into this year. So I think we've also taken I don't have the data, but what I've been hearing and kind of can see is we're taking a step back also in our attendance. And we know how that impacts learning. If you already have these disparities and you're not attending school,
Right.
so that's where the MOA comes in, and how do we, set the base, and based on where we're at, we have to, and then how do we move forward, and what is it going to take from McGazee, the partners, the school district to help in increasing, that graduation rate. So I'll just let you know that we are partnering with Indian Ed on a winter break academy. So we will be having credit recovery here on site and virtually for students to really, so we're starting that right away. Like, over the winter break, we'll be working with kids so that there's some credit earning that happens, even if it's from prior years or even this first quarter to get kids on track. So it's a priority of ours as an organization and a priority of Indian Ed to provide whatever we can to make up those credits so kids are on track.
Seems like y'all are doing a lot of work in support of the district, a lot of work in support of obviously the American Indian community and students in Minneapolis. And, you listed a handful of other cities around us. So I guess my final question to you is for our audience that is listening, what type of support do you all need? Does what type of advocacy can people do on behalf of American Indian students or in support of American Indian students?
Yeah, I think what we're providing in the classroom, and our strategy is a little different this year than prior years, is we're providing one-on-one individual plans each quarter and setting goals with students. So what we've learned from students just from surveys is more around that self-management. So we're really being a little more intentional, not only in the classroom as support, but then in the classroom one-on-one and then after school. And one of the things, is there isn't a lot of funding for organizations. It's either designated after school, and it has to be after school. But, what we found through basically the past 10, 15 years of work is like actually being in the classroom where kids get to know you, they get to know, what they're learning. All of those things are huge factors. And so I think our work in the classroom in St. Paul and Minneapolis is like, it makes a difference. You can see it we have a Wilder, if you want to look up Wilder, we had a 5-year grant where we were and we've modeled kind of our programming around that, and the graduation rate, we followed 9th graders all the way to their senior year, the difference that our program makes. So I would say, there needs to be, and not only for our community, but I would say for all communities, the districts only have so many dollars, right? And how can philanthropy and individual donors help bridge that gap for the funding that these students actually need more than the districts can provide or will be able to provide, right? So how do you invest in community organizations that then support what the districts are doing? Because we really do make a difference in moving that needle. So I would, the ESSER money is coming, forward, but really hope the districts and the state invest in community organizations that are working with our communities to make a difference.
That's great. Awesome. Well, Kelly, thank you so much for the time and the wisdom that you shared. I appreciate it. and letting me just kind of pick your brain and put you on the spot on a couple of different questions. So, but I think if you have nothing else to share, we can wrap. So thank you all for listening. And I hope you have a great rest of your day, Kelly.
Thank you.